Get your hands off that car. I don't know who let you in here, but this lot is for clients only. The woman who said it didn't even look up from her clipboard. She just assumed. Took one look at Miriam Achebe-Nwosu standing next to a 1967 Jaguar E-Type in the service bay of Hargrove Prestige Motorcars. Took in the natural hair, the worn canvas jacket, the grease that had somehow already found its way under her thumbnail, and decided everything she needed to know. Miriam didn't move. The woman, her name tag read Sandra, service coordinator, finally lifted her eyes. Ma'am, this vehicle belongs to a very important client. I'm going to have to ask you to step back. Miriam looked at the car. Then she looked at Sandra. Then she said very quietly, "It's my car." That was the moment the whole bay went a little sideways. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand what Hargrove Prestige Motorcars is in the first place. This isn't a shop where you bring your Civic in for an oil change. This is an institution. A heritage establishment on King Street West in Toronto that has, for nearly 40 years, handled the restoration and maintenance of the finest collector vehicles in the country. Their waiting list runs 18 months. Their clientele includes 3 former prime ministers, a handful of NHL team owners, and at least one celebrity whose publicist has a standing agreement with the shop about discretion. The mechanics, they prefer restoration technicians, wear pressed uniforms with the Hargrove crest embroidered on the chest. The waiting area has a proper espresso machine and leather club chairs, and a glass case displaying scale models of cars they've worked on over the decades. The point is, Hargrove doesn't make mistakes about who belongs there and who doesn't, except, apparently, they do. Miriam Achebe-Nwosu had inherited the E-Type from her father, who had bought it in 1971 from a man in Oakville who'd brought it over from England. Her father, Emmanuel Achebe-Nwosu, had been a mechanical engineer who came to Canada from Nigeria in 1968 with a doctorate, 2 suitcases, and a particular love for British sports cars that his colleagues at the university never quite understood. He'd maintained it himself for 30 years, kept meticulous records in a set of green leather notebooks, and when his hands got too unsteady to do the work properly, he'd handed the notebooks to Miriam and told her she was the only person he trusted with it. Emmanuel had passed the previous February. Miriam had spent 4 months grieving before she felt ready to deal with the car at all. Then she'd spent another 2 months going through the notebooks, understanding what her father had done, what the car still needed. Then she'd called Hargrove, because her father had called Hargrove once, 15 years earlier, and spoken to a man named Douglas Hargrove himself, and been told they weren't taking new clients. But the car was a genuine numbers matching 67 E-Type Series 1 with the 4.2-liter engine and the original interior intact. And her father had kept it in a condition that defied reasonable explanation. And when she sent the intake form with the photographs, she got a call back within 48 hours. So, she belonged there. She had a confirmed appointment. She had a file number and a name on the booking system and a handshake agreement with a man named Philip Hargrove, Douglas's son, now running the operation, about the restoration timeline and the not insignificant deposit she'd already paid. None of that was visible to Sandra from across a service bay. What happened next was this. Sandra had gone pale in the specific way that people go pale when they realize they've made a mistake in front of witnesses, which there were 2 restoration technicians at the adjacent bay, a young apprentice near the parts cabinet, and a man in an expensive charcoal suit who had just walked in through the interior door and was now standing very still, watching. I apologize, Sandra said. You're a client? I have a file number, Miriam said, if you'd like it. No, I know who you are. I mean, I know we were expecting you. I'm so sorry, I just didn't. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The 2 of them both knew exactly what she hadn't done. Miriam handed over her key fob. She said she'd like to speak to whoever was doing the primary assessment. She said it the way she said most things, without raising her voice, without drama, just clearly and with the settled patience of someone who has had to be patient many times before, and has learned that it costs her nothing and tends to unsettle other people considerably. The man in the charcoal suit came forward. His name was Jeffrey Marsden Cole. and he was Hargrove's head of restoration. 22 years, with the shop winner of 3 national concours awards, the man whose name appeared in the automotive press whenever anyone wanted a quote about the state of British classic car restoration in Canada. He had a handshake like a banker, and the careful eyes of someone who spent his days looking at things in very close detail. He shook Miriam's hand. He looked at the car. He said, with genuine respect, "Your father kept this extraordinarily well." "I know," Miriam said. For the first 3 weeks, things were fine. The assessment went smoothly. The car needed brake work, a carburetor rebuild, attention to the chrome on the rear bumper, and some careful intervention on the driver's side door seal that had developed a slow leak. Manageable work. Nothing that surprised anyone. Miriam got weekly updates by email and came in twice to see the progress, and both times Jeffrey himself walked her through the bay and explained what they'd found and what they were doing about it. And then the electrical problem appeared. It announced itself the way electrical problems in old Jaguars always do. Quietly, indirectly, in a way that made you doubt yourself before you doubted the car. The technician doing the brake lines noticed that one of the instrument panel gauges was reading wrong. He flagged it. Jeffrey looked at it. Jeffrey brought in a specialist named Randall Croft, who did nothing but electrical diagnostic on pre-1975 British vehicles, and who charged an amount of money per hour that Miriam didn't find out until later and was glad she hadn't known in advance. Randall Croft spent 2 days on the car. He emerged looking the way people look after 2 days of not finding something they were sure they'd find. He said the wiring harness appeared intact. He said the fault was intermittent, which was the worst kind. He said he'd traced it as far as he could, and his honest professional opinion was that the original factory wiring in this section of the car had a manufacturing inconsistency that had, over 57 years, become effectively impossible to isolate without pulling the entire front section of the car apart. Which would mean, he was sorry to say, significant disassembly, significant cost, and significant risk to the originality that made the car valuable in the first place. Jeffrey called Miriam. He was professional about it. He told her what Croft had said. He told her the options as he understood them. He said, and she remembered this specifically, because she wrote it down, "At this stage, I think we may have reached the limit of what we can responsibly do without compromising what you have." There was a pause on the line. Miriam said, "I'd like to come in." She came in the next morning. She brought one of the green leather notebooks. Jeffrey had arranged for them to meet in his office, which was a narrow room behind the main shop that smelled of oil and paper, and had, on one wall, a framed photograph of a 1955 Bentley that Hargrove had restored for a client in the 1980s. He had also arranged, without being asked, for Randall Croft to be present, and for the young apprentice from the Bay. His name was Owen, and he had been watching Miriam with the particular attention of someone who doesn't want to appear to be watching, to bring in the diagnostic report. Sandra was not present. Miriam had not asked about Sandra, and no one had brought her up. They were 15 minutes into the meeting when Miriam opened the notebook. Her father's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of an engineer who had spent decades annotating technical drawings. The notebook opened to a section from 1987. Emmanuel had dated every entry, and Miriam put it flat on Jeffrey's desk and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of a page. Jeffrey leaned forward. Randall Croft leaned forward. The paragraph described, in Emmanuel's careful hand, a fault he had found in 1987 in the instrument panel wiring. He had traced it to a specific junction behind the dashboard, where the factory had, on a small number of Series 1 cars produced in a particular window of 1966 and 1967, used a slightly different terminal block from their standard specification. Over time, the dissimilar metals in this non-standard block caused micro-corrosion at the connection points. Invisible to the eye, resistant to standard testing, but sufficient to produce exactly the kind of intermittent instrument fault they were now seeing. Emmanuel had corrected it in 1987 by sourcing a replacement block from a parts supplier in Coventry he'd found through correspondence with a Jaguar Owners Club in Birmingham. He had written down the supplier's name, the part number, and the exact procedure he'd used to access and replace the terminal block without removing the dashboard. He had also noted, in a bracket beside the procedure, that the fault was likely to recur within 30 to 40 years if the replacement block itself was not upgraded to a modern equivalent. It had been 37 years. Randall Croft read the entry twice. Then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "I've been working on Series 1 E-Types for 15 years, he said, and I've never come across this specific failure in documentation. My father documented everything," Miriam said. There was a beat of silence in the office. Owen, the apprentice, was standing near the door with his diagnostic report still in his hands and his mouth very slightly open. Jeffrey looked at the notebook. Then he looked at Miriam. He said, "Do you know if the supplier in Coventry still exists?" "I've already contacted them," Miriam said. "They do, and they stock the upgraded part." What happened after that is the part that people at Hargrove still talk about, if you happen to know the right people at Hargrove. Because Jeffrey Marsden Cole, to his genuine credit, didn't try to minimize what had just happened. He didn't claim they would have found it eventually, or try to explain why their process hadn't caught what a notebook written by a man who died in February had caught in an afternoon. He just said, "Mrs. Achebe-Nwosu, with your permission, I'd like to have Owen here take the lead on the repair, with Croft supervising. And I'd like to compensate you for the additional diagnostic time." Miriam said she appreciated that. She said she'd be happy for Owen to do the work. She looked at the young man by the door and said, "You've been paying attention this whole time. That matters in this work." Owen looked like he might actually need to sit down. But here's what Jeffrey didn't know, and wouldn't find out until later, when the Hargrove receptionist, a meticulous woman named Patricia Wells, was updating the client file and cross-referencing the intake form with Miriam's professional information. Miriam Achebe-Nwosu was not just a woman with a nice car and a dead father's notebooks. She was a professor of materials engineering at the University of Toronto, a published researcher in corrosion science, meaning the literal science of how metals fail over time, and the author of a textbook used in engineering programs at 11 universities across the country. She had, in other words, understood exactly what was happening inside that terminal block at a molecular level that Randall Croft, for all his skill, was not trained to think about. She had known within 10 minutes of hearing the description of the fault. She had come in with the notebook because she wanted them to understand it was her father's knowledge, not hers, that had cracked it. She wanted Emmanuel Achebe-Nwosu to get the credit. She wanted the green leather notebooks to be the thing that mattered. And so she had let them run their process, and she had waited, and she had come in when she was ready, and put the notebook on the desk and let the room figure it out. Patricia Wells, when she found all this out, told Jeffrey. Jeffrey sat with it for a moment. Then he said something that Owen, who happened to be in the office at the time, would later describe as the most unexpectedly human thing he'd ever heard a senior person at Hargrove say. Jeffrey said, "She let us look like experts right up until she didn't need to anymore." The repair took 6 days. The part arrived from Coventry by courier. Owen did the work under Croft's supervision, following Emmanuel's procedure from 1987 almost exactly, with one modification that Miriam suggested by email, and that Croft confirmed was consistent with more recent best practice. When the car was ready, Jeffrey called Miriam himself. He told her the fault was resolved, the instruments were reading correctly, and the car was ready for collection. He said that they had added the repair documentation to her file, and that, if she wished, they would scan and archive the relevant pages of her father's notebook as a reference for future work. Miriam said she would like that. She came in on a Thursday afternoon. The car was in the front bay this time, not the service bay, which was, at Hargrove, a particular distinction. They brought cars to the front bay for collection when they wanted the client to see them properly. Sandra was at the reception desk. She made eye contact with Miriam when she came through the door, and she said, "Mrs. Achebe-Nwosu, your car is ready." And she said it with the careful directness of someone who has thought about a moment for some time before it arrived. Miriam nodded. She said, "Thank you, Sandra." She didn't make it uncomfortable. That wasn't her style, And honestly, it wasn't necessary. Some things resolve themselves, simply by the truth of what happened becoming visible. Owen was in the bay when she came through. He handed her the key fob and gave her a brief rundown of the work. He'd clearly practiced it, and he was nervous, and he got through it well. When he finished, he said, "I learned something from this. I wanted you to know that." Miriam looked at him for a moment. He was young, couldn't have been more than 23, and he had the particular eagerness of someone just realizing how much there is to learn. She said, "Your name is Owen. Remember that what you learned here didn't come from a textbook or a diagnostic system. It came from a man who spent 30 years paying attention to one car. That's worth more than you think." Owen nodded. He looked like he was committing it to memory. She drove the E-Type home through downtown Toronto, up through the annex, windows down, because it was that particular kind of late October afternoon that decides to behave like September for one last day. The engine ran the way her father always said it should run. Smooth and willing, a sound like something alive. At a red light on Bloor, a man in a Range Rover pulled alongside and looked at the car with the frank admiration that a genuine Series 1 E-Type still commands in any era. And then he looked at Miriam, and she could see the moment his expression rearranged itself. She let the light change. She drove. She had done what she came to do. The car ran. The notebooks had done their work. Emmanuel Achebe-Nwosu, who had bought a British sports car in 1971 because he loved precision engineering and beautiful things, and who had spent the next 5 decades knowing every bolt and wire in it, with the exactness of a man who understood that attention is the deepest form of love he had from wherever he was, fixed his car one last time. She took the long way home. The Jaguar did not make a single sound that her father would not have recognized. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. We read every one of them. And if you know someone who's carried forward a parent's knowledge or craft, share this with them. There are more stories like Miriam's out there, and this channel exists to find them. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.